Where do we get our information about the history of Hanukkah and what is going on? What are the sources in which we do it? Now, we do know the following. We do know that after the death of Alexander of Macedonia, his empire was split between four generals. He had a huge empire. We know he died at the age of 31, and legend has it that he died of grief because he had conquered the whole known world, and he said he had no more worlds to conquer. That's the story. That's the story. Some say he was actually poisoned. Some say he died of plague. He did leave over a baby son who was very swiftly died. Again, the official account is pneumonia. That was almost certainly a poisoning because there was a huge fight who would take over the huge empire of Alexander of Macedonia, known in history, not in our tradition, as Alexander the Great. Now, there were four generals who took over his empire. They divided the empire in four, but for purposes of Jewish history, there are only two generals that are important. One is Talmai, Ptolmey, who took over Egypt and North Africa. And the other was Seleucus, who took over Syria and Turkey. So you have the Ptolemaic Empire, Egypt, North Africa. You have the Seleucid Empire, which is Turkey and Syria. Obviously, if you can envision this in a map, you will see that Eretz Yisrael is between those two empires. And for more than 100 years, there was a constant war between the empires in which Eretz Yisrael, like a football, was going back and forth between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. In Perek Yud Aleph of the book of Daniel, which was written at the time of the Chorban of the first Beis Hamikdash, way before this, there is a long prophetic description of the wars between the king of the north and the king of the south. And it goes into a lot of detail in Perek Yud Aleph of the book of Daniel. And most Mefarshim understand that indeed what is being described are the wars between the Ptolemaic Empire and the Seleucid Empire. In other words, Seleucus was the king of the north, Syria, Turkey, and Ptolemy was the king of the south, but they had successors, and they fought for over 100 years. Basically, at some point in time, a Seleucid king called Antiochus III. He's not our bad Antiochus. He's a different Antiochus. Antiochus III is also called in history Antiochus the Great. Had a decisive victory over Ptolemaic Empire and was able to conquer Eretz Yisrael. So Eretz Yisrael was conquered by Antiochus III. Antiochus III had a son. Again, I'm obviously being very general here, but too many names, too many dates will confuse you and will confuse me. So I'm going to try to keep it at a minimum. But basically, Antiochus III had a son, Antiochus IV, and he is the infamous Antiochus of the Hanukkah story. Antiochus IV gave himself the title Antiochus Epiphanes, which also means Antiochus the God or Antiochus the Divine. Behind his back, his own people called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means Antiochus the Insane. So instead of Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes. Antiochus the Fourth, and there's actually Antiochus the Fifth, Sixth, Seventh, but Antiochus the Fourth was the person who made gezeros against the practice of Judaism. He prohibited, upon pain of death, practices of mitzvot like Shabbos, like keeping kosher, bris milah, and the like. And he actually was the first example in the ancient world of laws that were specifically targeted to take Jews away from the Torah. It's very interesting. We've had plenty of bad guys before Antiochus. We had Nebuchadnezzar, who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. We had Sancheriv, who exiled the 10 tribes. We had Paro, who enslaved the Jewish people brutally in Mitzrayim. We had plenty of evil kings. We had Haman, who hurt the Jewish people tremendously. But let's take even Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar didn't care if you wore tefillin or you kept Shabbos or you kept kosher. I mean, he destroyed the Beis Hamikdash primarily to squash a rebellion. And even if he mandated people bow down to him, that was an ego thing. Haman didn't care if you were from or not from, like Hitler. Haman didn't care about uprooting the Torah. The very first king, essentially the very first king in Jewish history, who specifically targeted the observances of mitzvos, was Antiochus Epiphanes Antiochus IV. Now, why did he do that? Why did Antiochus invent this new type of persecution? You're not allowed to keep the Torah. The truth of the matter is, he was pushing an agenda that had already originated with Alexander, and that was the agenda of Hellenism, Greek culture, whether it's art, philosophy, and the like. But Alexander's idea was, and this was followed by both the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid rulers until Antiochus IV, is that Hellenism should be a voluntary process, that when the Jewish people and all the other cultures see how beautiful and wonderful this is, they're going to fall into place. And in truth, unfortunately, they were falling into place. A very large percentage of the Jewish people, maybe a majority, were Hellenists, Hellenistic leanings, including not keeping the Torah, before Antiochus IV. So Antiochus IV essentially wanted to accelerate the process of acculturation, of Hellenization, of assimilation. He wanted to do it by coercion because he wanted to speed up the process. The truth of the matter is, he didn't have to, even from his perspective, he didn't have to do any of this, but he did it. And as a result, there was essentially 3 or 4 years of severe Jewish religious persecution in which many, many Jews succumbed, meaning many had already assimilated on a voluntary basis. Others succumbed to the coercion. There were a small group of people, right? We know them as the Maccabees, the Hasmonean. I'll describe them in a moment, who stood up for God. Now, at some point in Antiochus's persecution, he actually desecrated the temple, meaning to say the Beis Hamikdash was invaded. Houses of prostitution were set up in the Beis Hamikdash itself. Idols were put up in the Beis Hamikdash, and even pig, chazer, was sacrificed on the Mizbeach. This was a total desecration of the Beis Hamikdash. And then what we have the revolt of the group of people who are known as Maccabees or Maccabim or Hasmonean. So again, let me just try to be more exact regarding the terms. The Maccabees or the Maccabim were essentially, again, the spiritual leader of this uprising against Yavan. Again, first of all, let me just explain something. You might wonder, why do we always talk about this as a war against the Yavanim? Antiochus was not in Greece. Antiochus was in Syria. So people always say, well, these are the Syrian Greeks. What on earth are the Syrian Greeks? Are they Greeks or are they Syrian? The answer is that geographically, they, of course, were in Syria. That was the seat of the Seleucid kingdom, and Antiochus IV was the king there. Syria, Turkey, was his fundamental empire. But his dynasty was a successor, ultimately, of Alexander of Macedonia, and the cultural values that they were espousing were Greek. So yeah, they are Syrian Greeks, not from Greece, but it is Yavan. It is the culture of Yavan that they are trying to impose on the Jewish people. Now, the spiritual leader of the revolt against Yavan, against religious oppression, was a very elderly man who died very soon after the revolt, and this is, of course, Matisyahu ben Yochanan. And in Al Hanisim, he is described as Matisyahu ben Yochanan, Kohen Gadol. But let me point out, there's a lot of ambiguity. Who is the Kohen Gadol? Is it Matisyahu that's Kohen Gadol? Or is it his father Yochanan who is Kohen Gadol? Now, the problem is there is no historical record that Matisyahu ever served as Kohen Gadol. However, there are a number of people called Yochanan who did serve as Kohen Gadol. And here's something very, very fascinating. One of the Yochanan Kohen Gadols is described as being a righteous person, and he was a Kohen Gadol for 80 years. And after serving as Kohen Gadol for 80 years, he became a Sadducee, he became a Sduki. He renounced Torah. Now, there's a tremendous amount of controversy. Many say that is not Matisyahu's father. That's a later person. But there is a minority view that the Yochanan Kohen Gadol who became a Sduki was none other than Matisyahu's own father, which is very tragic. But if that is true, and again, it's only a minority position, you can understand why Matisyahu felt so strongly that Hellenism was poison. We have to fight it. We can't let it stand. Because he saw his own father, who had been a tzaddik, get swept up, because Sadducees were essentially Hellenists. I mean, that was ultimately their cultural identification. So it's very telling that Matisyahu felt we have to revolt. So Matisyahu is also called Hashmonai. So the family of Matisyahu are the Hashmonaim. And the question then becomes, what is the meaning of Hashmonaim? So once again, everything has multiple meanings here. Some say Hashmonaim is a corruption of the word Chashmanim. If you remember in Maoz Sur, the stanza that talks about Hanukkah talks of Bimei Chashmanim. Now, what is Chashmanim? So Chashmanim in Tehillim is used for nobility. So Chashmonaim is a simply title of nobility, distinction. Or some say Chashmon is a city in Sefer Yehoshua, and that might have been the origin of the family. So Chashmonaim can mean nobility. Chashmonim can mean from Chashmon, etc. Or Chashmonai could actually be the name of an ancestor of Matisyahu. So there was kind of the family name based on an ancestor. Be it as it may, therefore, the term Chashmonaim is limited to Matisyahu and his sons and descendants. Now, the word Maccabee was originally a title assumed by one of Matisyahu's sons, who was considered to be the greatest of the warriors, Yehuda HaMaccabee. And here too we have a machlokes. What does Maccabee mean? It was not a health service in those days. So it all depends on whether you spell Maccabee with a kuf or Maccabee with a chaf. If it is spelled with a kuf, it is connected to the word makevet, which in Tanakh means a hammer, a sledgehammer. And it's a tribute to his military prowess. He was like a smashing hammer. If you spell it with a chaf, so some say, then it's uncertain, but some say it's an acronym, it's an abbreviation for a slogan that was emblazoned on their flag, Mi kamocha ba'elim Hashem. Who is as mighty as Hashem? And they had that flag when they went into battle. Now you may ask me, given the fact that there actually is a book that is called Sefer HaMaccabim, so why don't we just, now it doesn't tell you what Maccabee means, but it has the word Maccabee many times. So why don't we simply look if it is spelled with a kuf or a chaf? And the answer is very pashut. We do not have an original Hebrew version of the book of the Maccabees. Maybe there was a version and we lost it, or maybe there was no version in Hebrew at all. The book of the Maccabees came down to us only in Greek. If you find a book of the Maccabees in Hebrew, which you can find Hebrew translations, but they are later, they are translations from the Greek. They are not original Hebrew. So as a result, in Greek, you can't really tell the word Maccabee, you can't really tell what it meant in Hebrew. And that is why we have uncertainty. And by the way, the Chazam Sofer gives another explanation for Maccabee. He actually says it's Matisyahu Kohen ben Yochanan, which is actually an unusual way to refer. Normally we would say Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen, but Matisyahu Kohen, although if we say Yochanan became Itztuki, maybe Matisyahu didn't want to give his father that honor if you going to that. Okay, so Maccabee was not the family name. Maccabee was originally a title given to Yehuda HaMaccabee. However, it later got extended to the entire army. The entire army got known as the Maccabees, the Maccabee army. So the difference in the terms is Hashmonaim is a family designation for Matisyahu Ubanav and their descendants. And later, when they established a kingdom, that's called Malchus Hashmonai. Maccabee was originally the title of Yehuda HaMaccabee, and then it got applied to the Maccabean revolt, to the army as a whole. Now, here is the interesting thing. The book of the Maccabees, Sefer HaMaccabim, which some give it an alternative title, Sefer Hashmonaim, but Sefer HaMaccabim seems to be its title. There actually is 4 different books. There's Maccabim Aleph, just like Malachim, but here it's 4. Maccabim Aleph, Maccabim Beis, Maccabim Gimel, Maccabim Dalet. But in terms of the history of the Hanukkah story, it's only Maccabim Aleph and Beis. Gimel and Dalet are philosophical and deal with other themes. So they're not really, why they're even called the books of the Maccabees is a bit of a mystery, but Aleph and Beis are the history of Hanukkah, and it goes into much more detail than maybe most people would be interested in. It goes through every battle, goes through every war, every type of military strategy. I am told that in West Point, the book of the Maccabees, Maccabees 1 and 2, is actually studied in courses on warfare because it was an outstanding example of guerrilla warfare, which dealt. It's okay. Yeah. Again, if you remember Vietnam, those of you that are a little older, right? So Vietnam was, you had these rice paddy peasants who were able to more or less defeat the United States based on guerrilla warfare. So West Point at the time instituted, we have to learn Sefer HaMaccabim, a book of the Maccabees, because there you also have a small, untrained Jewish army fighting against the greatest military power in the world, and they were victorious. So in the book of the Maccabees, there's tremendous amount of military history and detail that maybe from a religious perspective we would not be so interested in, but it goes through every single. Of course, even in Tanakh, we often have a lot of descriptions of battles, but here it goes into a lot of detail. However, let me point out that in spite of the fact that the book of the Maccabees is filled with military history, it is a religious book. It is a book of commitment to Hashem. It is a book that communicates the message that we were not fighting for political independence. We were not fighting just because of national liberation. We were fighting to be able to observe the Torah and the mitzvahs. And indeed, you have to remember how miraculous this was. If you look in the Al Hanisim, right, you gave the strong into the hands of the weak, the large numbers into the hands of the few, etc. Keep in mind that not only were the Maccabees untrained, not only were they not having a lot of food or supplies, but most of the Jewish people thought the Maccabees were fanatic. They thought that, why are you stopping the advance of Jewish civilization to become acculturated and the like? So imagine this: you're a small army fighting against the greatest military power in the world, and your own OUisrael does not support you. It was tough being a Maccabee. So who wrote the book of the Maccabees? So the answer is we don't know who wrote it. As I say, though, interestingly enough, although the War of the Maccabees was a war against Hellenism, many understand that the book was written in Greek, maybe to communicate the message to assimilated Jews that they need to come back. And the book of the Maccabees is a it's very early, meaning to say it was written right after or shortly after the war. So it's a very early chronicle. And Maccabees 2, again, we're not sure who wrote it, goes over a lot of the same history. But it's interesting that Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2, both of which are religious books. Again, I want to emphasize this. Both books say this was a struggle, a revolt for Torah, for mitzvos, for avodas Hashem. Both books are the same. But there's a very interesting nafkamina, a very interesting difference in the focus of the two books. The focus of Maccabees 1 is on military prowess and victory. All the battles are described, how we beat Antiochus and we beat this general and that general, and we captured this territory and that territory. Maccabees 2 has many stories of martyrdom al Kiddush Hashem. So, for example, the famous story of Hannah and her 7 sons, that they refused to bow down to Avodah Zarah, and each son was mercilessly slaughtered in a horrendous way. And even the last one, who was a little boy. And Antiochus himself had rachamim. He threw his ring on the floor and said, okay, you don't have to bow down. Just pick up the ring so it looks like you bow down. And the little kid says, you're not going to tell me what to do. I believe in Hashem. Right, the famous story of the 7 sons. And then, of course, it says Hannah fell off a roof. So again, that's a whole other story. Did she commit suicide? What exactly happened? Meaning, did she go crazy? Whatever it would be. But that is in Maccabees number 2, which means in looking at and this is very interesting. This has a contemporary application. In looking at the heroism of the Jewish people, Maccabees 1 is focusing on their military prowess. Maccabees 2 is focusing on their willingness to die al Kiddush Hashem. Now, if you think about this was precisely a major issue in how to commemorate the Shoah. Here in Eretz Yisrael, it's observed in America, other countries as well, we have Yom HaShoah. Now, the date that is chosen for Yom HaShoah, you would think Holocaust commemoration should not be a controversial issue. Everybody needs to remember this. And yet, in Eretz Yisrael, everything, without exception, is a controversial issue. And Yom HaShoah is, and certainly was, maybe less so today, but it certainly was in the early years of the state, which were shortly after the Holocaust, were very controversial. Let me explain why. Well, halachically, okay, it's a smaller point. Halachically, there's a problem because it's during the month of Nisan, and during the month of Nisan, you're not supposed to have sad occasions. So it's like, so you can't win, right? Yom HaTzmaut is during Sfira, so you got a problem with happy occasions during Sfira. Yom HaShoah is during Nisan, you got a problem with sad occasions during Nisan, right? So maybe reverse. Let's have Yom HaTzmaut in Nisan. Okay, whatever it would be. But the reason that date in Nisan was chosen is that was the anniversary of the fall of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, why was that controversial? Because you have to know that part of, and again, I'm oversimplifying here, but part of the early Zionist philosophy, not early, but the post-war Zionist philosophy, early years of the state, there was a certain sense of shame about the Jews who died in the Shoah, because the idea was they went to their death like sheep in the slaughter. They didn't resist. They didn't fight back. But we're going to be the new Jew. We're not going to be the gullus Jew anymore. We're going to have our army. No one's going to push us around anymore. And with great sadness, for me to even say this. The victims of the Holocaust were sometimes disparaged. So when you're looking around for how do you commemorate the Holocaust, you got to look, with that philosophy, you have to look for the one instance, the one major instance, where there actually was armed resistance against Nazi oppression. And that, of course, was the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, there aren't that many survivors of the Holocaust still alive, but many, many people were deeply hurt by this. Again, not disparaging the heroism of the Warsaw Ghetto, but it was almost like making a statement that you people who didn't fight, you know, there's something wrong with you, there's something weak with you. We need to glorify the fighters. So I would suggest going back 1,000 years, or actually 1,500 years, that this might be essentially the different orientations of Maccabees 1 and Maccabees 2. Maccabees 2 says, let's glorify. Again, both books are religious. I want to emphasize that. They are not secular. But let's glorify the fact that we fought against Antiochus. And the other book says, but let's also remember the people who died al Kiddush Hashem because they didn't have the wherewithal to fight. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the ability. But they were willing to give up their life al Kiddush Hashem. So it's so interesting that I think the two books reflect a different orientation, which to this very day has a certain controversy in how you commemorate the Holocaust. You know, I remember learning as a kid a song, a Hanukkah song, which was an innocent little Hanukkah song that we sang in kindergarten, but it is such kafira. Ay, ay, ay. How could it ever get into even a modern Orthodox day school? Mi yamalel gvuros Yisrael osam miyimna hein b'chol dor yakum hagibor go el ha'am. Right, everyone, at least from America, I don't know. They probably it started here. It was an Israeli song. Now, what's so bad about that? Mi yamalel gvurot Yisrael. Where does the phrase mi yamalel, who can speak? It's from Tehillim. Mi yamalel gvuros Hashem. Who can articulate the greatness of Hashem? So how did mi yamalel gvurot Hashem turn into mi yamalel gvurot Yisrael? This was a conscious attempt, an intentional attempt to obliterate God from the story of the Maccabees. Hein b'chol dor yokum hagibor. Goel ha'am. Goel ha'am. Who is Goel ha'am? Baruch atah Hashem Goel Yisrael. Now, some people knock the Israeli Declaration of Independence because it says Sur Yisrael. I think that's a bogus accusation. Sur Yisrael can mean Hashem. So whatever. I don't consider that a problem. But Mi Yamalel, it's a little children's ditty, has a lot of theological problems because it's reading God out of the Hanukkah story. And it turns Hanukkah into a war of national liberation rather than a war against religious persecution. And as I want to point out, even though Maccabees 1 makes a very, very big story about military prowess and heroism and the like, so it certainly emphasizes the greatness of that struggle, but it does so in a context of serving Hashem. I do want to emphasize this. Neither book of the Maccabees is a secular book. They are. I mean, it's not Tanakh, so it's not Kadosh. It's not Kadosh, but they are not secular books. These are books of Emunah in Hashem, and recognizing that the struggle is against religious persecution. But one book emphasizes the military heroism, and the other book emphasizes a bit more the spiritual heroism of dying al Kiddush Hashem. Okay, so here's the story. According to Maccabees 1, interestingly enough, Antiochus and the Yevanim entered, I don't know if he entered, but the Yevanim entered the Beis Hamikdash and desecrated it, violated it on the 25th of Kislev in the year 168 BCE. The war initially lasted 3 years, and Miyom Liyom, on the 25th of Kislev, 165 BCE, 3 years day to day, the temple was recaptured. Of course, there was a lot of work that had to be done that lasted for months, but they lit the menorah, and that's where the Hanukkah story happened. Now, here is the thing you need to know, though, and that is the actual intense struggle from desecration of the temple until reclamation of the temple and the Hanukkah miracle was only 3 years. But the war against Antiochus and his successors lasted for another 20 years. Let me just have that. I don't want to give you too many dates, but let me just give you 3 dates. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. The temple was desecrated 168 BCE. The temple was regained after prolonged military struggle on the 25th of Kislev, 165 BCE. Okay, 3 years later, Miyom Liyom, and that's the miracle of Hanukkah. But the war lasted for more than 25 years, and the Hasmonean monarchy was not established until 140 BCE. So this is a common mistake that people make. People think that the Hanukkah story happened at the end of a war. The actual story of Hanukkah happened towards the beginning of the war, and there was a protracted struggle for many, many years after that. Now, how do I know this? This is what the book of the Maccabees tells us. So, Baruch Hashem, Hanukkah was a wonderful thing that we regained the Beis HaMikdash, and we could serve Hashem in the Beis HaMikdash, but there was still persecution in the rest of Eretz Israel. A war was still going on. And in fact, of course, Mattisyahu was long dead. Mattisyahu was dead before the Hanukkah story. But 4 out of his 5 sons died after the Hanukkah story in the course of years. The last survivor was Shimon. And Shimon became the first of the Hasmonean kings to be proclaimed as king when Eretz Israel was liberated from, again, Antiochus IV was long gone himself, but from whatever Antiochus was ruling at the time. The source of this narrative is in the... So again? Oh, the name Hasmonean? So there are different interpretations. Some say Hasmonean means noble or distinguished. Some say Hasmonean means from the city of Hashmon. And some say Hasmonean was the name of Mattisyahu's ancestor, and that became the family name. Yeah. Okay. So keep in mind, let me just remind you that from 140 onwards, which is many years after Hanukkah, right? It's not after Hanukkah. So the Hasmoneans, the Hasmonean, established a monarchy which lasted for around 100 years until the Romans came in. And this is called the Hasmonean monarchy. And what's interesting is, if any of you ever read George Orwell's Animal Farm, which is a parody of the Russian Revolution, the basic story there was animals revolted to overthrow the human rulers, and eventually the animals became just as bad, or at least some of them, as the human rulers. This is the bane of much revolutionary activity, that the ones who overthrow the tyrants themselves become tyrannical. So this is one of the paradoxes in history. The Maccabees, the Hasmonean, fought against the Yevanim in order to overthrow Hellenism and reestablish the primacy of Torah. The initial Malchei Hasmonean continued with that hashkafa, but eventually the later Hasmonean monarchs themselves became Hellenists and persecutors of the Chachamim, they became the very enemy that they had overthrown. Now, the Ramban writes in Parshas Vayechi a very famous thing. The Gemara tells us that the Hasmonean monarchy was actually wiped out by Herod. Herod had been a slave of Malchei Hashmonai, and he actually wiped it out. And Chazal say, therefore, anyone who says that they're from Hasmonean monarchy is a slave, because Herod married a woman. Herod had been a slave. Herod had married a woman from Hashmonai. She committed suicide. So any descendants of Malchei Hashmonai are from Herod, and therefore, right. So the Ramban raises the question. You'll see, this will answer your question. That if the Malchei Hashmonai were Chasidei Elyon, they started off as the righteous of the righteous, why should they have been wiped out so completely? And why did they become bad? Why did they become Hellenists? Why did they become Rishayim? So the Ramban says, although the original Hashmonaim were certainly tzaddikim gemurim, they should not have assumed a monarchy over OUisrael. And the Ramban gives two reasons for this. Reason number one is Yaakov Avinu said in his bracha on his deathbed, Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda, the scepter of authority, the scepter of kingship belongs to the tribe of Yehuda, David HaMelech's tribe. And therefore the Malchei Hashmonai should have looked around for a Davidic successor. That's one reason the Ramban gives. And therefore they were deserving of death and extinction. The second reason he gives is actually even more interesting, I think. He says that there's a special sin for a Kohen to be a Melech. It's not just he's not from Yehuda. A Kohen should not be a Melech. What is it? Separation of church and state. A Kohen is the religious leaders of OUisrael. Religious leaders, I'm just quoting here, religious leaders should not be in politics. Religious leaders need to be outside of politics so they can speak, as the expression goes, truth to power. Okay, again, you can draw your own conclusions. I'm just mentioning what the Ramban says. The Ramban's point is that we got to separate the Kohen from the politician, not because we don't want religion to influence politics. That's actually okay. That's the way it's supposed to be. We don't want politics to be an influence on religion, because we want the religious voice to be pure, to be untainted, not to have agendas connected to power or money. And therefore, the religious voice needs to be outside. So, B'kitzer, the Ramban gives two reasons why it was actually an Avera for Hashmonaim to establish a Malchus. Now, Rabbi Kamneski suggests, if you look in the book of Maccabees, when Shimon ben Matisyahu was proclaimed king in the year 140 BCE, before the Common Era, he did not use the word Melech. He was proclaimed Nasi Yisrael. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky suggests that Shimon didn't want to take the title Melech, precisely because of Lo Yasur Shevet mi Yehuda. But his successors, Yanai HaMelech and the like, they did take the title Melech eventually. Shimon perhaps envisioned his role as interim, meaning they did not find a suitable Davidic successor. At that time, he did not intend to establish a hereditary monarchy. It turned into a hereditary monarchy that lasted for more than 100 years, slightly more than 100 years, I think 103 years, until the Romans moved in. And by the way, how did the Romans move in? This was a civil war between two Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And they invited the great Roman general Pompey, and that day, one of the sides invited Pompey to kind of help them out. And once the Romans are there, hey, we're here, we might as well take over. In fact, this is actually historically one of the meanings of the very famous statement that the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam. So it has many, many meanings, but from a historian standpoint, it could actually refer to something that occurred more than 100 years before the Churban, and that is the temple was destroyed by the Romans. What brought the Romans into Eretz Yisrael was the sinat chinam between Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. So we're actually going back more than 100 years that it was the sinna between brothers that gave the Romans a foothold in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so one interesting point, therefore, that emerges is that the Hanukkah story was not the end of the struggle, but it did mean we regained the Beis Hamikdash. Now, let's answer a very simple question. Why is there a holiday of Hanukkah? So I'm going to give you three sources. Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2, and a work that's much later than both of them, and that is Megillas Tanis. Maccabees 1 simply says, when the Jewish people regained the Beis Hamikdash on the 25th of Kislev, and there was a lot of cleanup. The cleanup may have been nimshach for months and months. They wanted to have a dedication ceremony. And just as the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu was dedicated over 8 days, because there were the 7 days of preliminary and then Rosh Chodesh Nisan, so they wanted a Chanukah Habayit of 8 days, which means Hanukkah. What does Hanukkah mean? Some say Chanukah, they rested on the 25th, but the simple meaning is Hanukkah is dedication. So the book of the Maccabees says a very simple thought. The holiday of Hanukkah is to commemorate the 8-day rededication ceremony of the second Beis Hamikdash after it had been reclaimed from the desecration of the Greeks. Now, here is the thing. Maccabees 1 does not say Hanukkah is 8 days because of the miracle of the oil. And Maccabees 1 doesn't even mention the miracle of the oil. Hanukkah is 8 days because Chanukah Habayit was 8 days. Why was Chanukah Habayit 8 days? Because Chanukah HaMishkan was 8 days. So now I just want to add something to Maccabees 1, and you might ask Akasha. It is true that the dedication of the Mishkan was 8 days. But when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis Hamikdash, look in the book of Malachim Aleph,
7 plus 7.
Yeah, you will see that the dedication of the Beis Hamikdash was 14 days, 7-7. So when they make a dedication ceremony for the Bayit Sheni, why did they base it on the Mishkan rather than the first Beis Hamikdash? So here's the answer I would give you. There's a Medrash Pesikta that says the following. When the Jewish people began constructing the Mishkan after Yom Kippur, they actually were finished in Kislev. They were ready to put up the Mishkan in Kislev. But Hashem wanted to defer it to Nisan, because that's the month of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So, as the Midrashim often say, the month of Kislev was very upset that it was deprived of a chance to be the month of dedication. So Hashem promised there will be a future dedication of the temple, Hanukkah, that will be in Nisan. So now I think it's very beautiful, because if Hanukkah became the month of dedication as a makeup for a Kislev losing that zechutz in the time of the Mishkan, it makes perfect sense why the duration of the dedication would be the same as the duration of the Mishkan. So this is actually a very simple answer to the most famous question of Hanukkah. This is the question that is called the Beis Yosef's question, and that is, if you celebrate Hanukkah 8 days because the oil lasted 8 days, the miracle was only 7 days. The first day there was enough oil. So why is Hanukkah 8 days? Hanukkah ought to be 7 days. Famous kasha. And in the passage of time, the answers to this question grow exponentially. When I was a kid, there are 20 answers to this question, right? Well, no. I saw in a sefer, there's 1,000 answers to this question, and that's big. I remember like 3 years ago, there were 500 answers to the question. Now there's 1,000 answers. Who knows? It's going to be like pi, the number that doesn't, whatever, the number that doesn't have any ending. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't call these 1,000 different answers. Sometimes they make a minor little knach in something and they call it a separate answer, but be it as it may. But if you look at the history of the book of the Maccabees, you have a very simple answer. The 8 days of Hanukkah is not because of the miracle of the Pach Hashemen. The 8 days of Hanukkah is because Chanukah Habayit was 8 days. Right? That's why it's 8 days. Chanukah Habayit. So that's a very, very simple, elegant answer. But this does leave us with a theological problem. If the book of the Maccabees, which was written right around the time of the event, does not mention the miracle of the Pach Hashemen, so does that mean it was a made-up story? Of course not. I'll give you the answer ahead of time in case I can't finish. Of course not. But okay, don't walk out. It's a true story. But the question becomes: the book of the Maccabees does not mention it. That's undeniable. Now, let me just mention another thing. Maccabees 2 gives another reason why there's a holiday of Hanukkah. This is actually very, very fascinating. It says that for 3 years the Yidden did not have access to the Beis Hamikdash. It was desecrated by the Yavanim. And that means that the Shalosh Regalim were not observed. Now, the last regal that was closest to the Hanukkah liberation was Sukkot. Sukkot is treated as an 8-day festival because you have Sukkot and then Shmini Atzeret, so it's, in terms of a pilgrimage, it's one long pilgrimage festival. And therefore, Hanukkah was enacted for 8 days at the time to commemorate, to make up for a missed Sukkot. Just like if you miss a Shmona Esrei, so you can make it up in the next Tefillah, but you can't make up two. They couldn't make up the other regalim that they missed. Now, halachically, in fact, in Maccabees 2, it even says the people spontaneously brought lulav and esrogs during Hanukkah to make up for that. Now, halachically, this carries no water. You can't make up Sukkot by keeping it in Hanukkah. So this is not a halachic issue, but it was a feeling of people that they wanted to connect to the regalim that they were not able to keep. Now, because of this, there is no remez in Chazal to connecting Hanukkah to Sukkot, because this was a non-halachic judgment. But there is one obscure place where this comes up, and that is in the famous machlokas between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Famous machlokas. How do you observe the Hanukkah mitzvah? According to Beis Hillel, you add a candle every night, which is what we do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Malin Bakodesh. Go up in Kedusha. But Beit Shammai has the odd procedure of starting with 8 and going down. And the Gemara says, but Beis Hillel, we understand, because in holiness you always want to go up. But why does Beis Shammai go down? So the Gemara's answer is, Beis Shammai wants to follow the pattern of the sacrifices of Sukkot. If you remember, of course, that itself needs explanation. Maybe I'll leave it for another year. But if you look at the Sukkot Musafim, it's 13, 12, it goes down. So Beit Shammai wants to model Hadlakas Haneros after the pattern of the Sukkot offering. Now that's in the Gemara. Now the question is, what's the connection? So I would suggest that the Shammai practice is a remnant, almost a fossil of the ancient idea that was enshrined in Sefer HaMaccabean base, that the 8 days of Hanukkah were a somewhat a non-halachic makeup for the 8 days of Sukkot, and therefore through the lights of Hanukkah we want to mimic the Karbanos of Sukkot. Again, this is an example. I think this is actually a very interesting example of how historical knowledge, which is not emphasized in the yeshiva world at all, but historical knowledge can actually illuminate, no pun intended, but can shed a lot of light on Chazal's statements. That you don't really understand Chazal's statements unless you have a sense of history, and this is a very good example of that. Now, once again, we're left with the problem. I hate to leave you with this problem, but I don't know if I have time. And that is, Maccabees 1 does not mention the miracle of the oil, and Maccabees 2 does not mention the miracle of the oil. Maccabees, in fact, it doesn't mention the mitzvah of lighting candles. It says Hanukkah is a holiday. So Maccabees 1 says Hanukkah is a holiday because of the 8-day Chanukah Tabayit. Maccabees 2 says Hanukkah is a holiday because it was a non-halachic makeup for the 8 days of Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret. Yeah. Yes, that is correct. That is also correct. Al-Hanisim also does not mention the miracle of the oil. It does mention they lit the menorah, but that's just simply saying they did the mitzvah of menorah. There is no reference. So that would be a third thing to add. So where does the story of the Pach Hashemen come from? Now, the Gemara brings it, but the Gemara brings it from an earlier source. So I'll just say that the source that it brings it from is a document called Megillat Tanit, Megillat Tanis. Now, Megillat Tanis, which means a scroll of fasting, but it's a misleading title, is actually a list of holidays that you're not allowed to fast because they're holidays. And most of these days we do not observe today. Most of them are all sorts of military victories, etc. And we actually don't observe the Megillas Tanis holidays as holidays, except for Hanukkah, which is mentioned in Megillat Tanis. And in Megillat Tanis, when was it written? It actually is the earliest document of the oral Torah that was written down. It is earlier than the Mishnah. It was written down a few decades after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. The Mishnah was written around the year 200. The Churban is 70. Megillat Tanis is like halfway between, which means the following. I'll make up a date or an approximate date. Let's assume Megillat Tanis is around 100 Common Era. I'm giving you an exact date. That means it is more than 200 years after the Hanukkah story, right? So whoever wrote Megillat Tanis was certainly not a witness to any Hanukkah story. And it records the famous story that all of us know, that they found a jar of oil that was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol, that was pure, it was not contaminated, and there was only enough oil for one day. And Baruch Hashem, a miracle happens that it burned for 8 days. And this is the holiday of Hanukkah, which means the story of the Pach Hashemen is not recorded in a source that is earlier than 200 years after the story allegedly occurred. Maccabees 1 does not mention it. Maccabees 2 does not mention it. So what are we to make of that? I guess that's a critical question. Those who are skeptics, those who are non-believers, those who are secularists, those who are academics, come to the conclusion, which I have to say off the top of my right away, that's not me. Some people think it is me, but that's not me. They say, Baba Maisa, story, made up, didn't happen. Our attitude as religious people who believe in Chazal say it certainly did happen. But it was not the reason for the holiday. That much I think is fair to emphasize. And the reason why it was not mentioned is because it wasn't necessarily known. You have to understand here, this is a very quiet miracle. Where is the menorah located? The menorah is located in the Heichal. Who is allowed to even go into the Heichal? Only Kohanim. Many Jews didn't live in Yerushalayim. And if you lived in Yerushalayim, you didn't always visit the Beis HaMikdash. And even if you visited the Beis HaMikdash, the menorah was in an inaccessible room. And if you happened to see it burning, well, they did light the menorah every day anyway. So in other words, if at any moment in time I see the menorah burning, I don't know when it was lit, because menorah was always lit. I mean, I don't mean it was always lighting, but it was always, there was a mitzvah of lighting. So as a result, the theory might be that this was literally an unknown miracle. This was a miracle that the Kohanim who were there day and night were aware of. And maybe they felt not even to be mefarsim it so much, although we don't know why that would be. And therefore, the fact that it was not the reason for Hanukkah does not negate its truth. Now, the Maharal makes the point, though, that although he didn't have access to the book of the Maccabees, but he was machavan on his own. He actually says the Iker holiday of Hanukkah is Chanukah Beis Hamikdash. That's what he says, not the Neiros. But Hashem had to do a miracle of Neiros that was supernatural. So we shouldn't attribute our military victory to our own prowess. In other words, there's an attitude that the Torah warns us against called kochi v'yotzim yadi, that a person thinks it's my abilities that have been triumphant. So Hashem does the supernatural miracle of oil to say, don't think you're such a big shot. Listen, I can make one day of oil burn for 8 days, so I can make your puny army have great military victories. So the Maharal says we celebrate Hanukkah by Neiros to think of that miracle, not because that was the reason for the Chag, but to give us a perspective that it all comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So that's the Maharal. So now one could also say that Hanukkah version 1, Hanukkah version 2, meaning to say Hanukkah version 1 was a celebration of military victories, but when the Hasmonean themselves became Hellenistic, Chazal wanted to emphasize the spiritual miracle of the Neiros. So the Neiros became dominant as Malchei Hasmonai degenerated. Right? So there's a and there's the point, the upshot here, I'm sorry if things are a little confusing, but the upshot of all of this is there are two different celebrations going on. There's the rededication of the temple and the military victory. There's the miracle of the oil. At different times in our tekufot, sometimes one was the main emphasis. Sometimes the other was the emphasis. Maccabees 1 and 2 failed to even talk about the miracle of the oil. Megillus Tainus does. Of course, some want to say, even politically, Megillus Tainus was written after the Churban Beis Hamikdash. You don't want to say you're celebrating a holiday about the overthrow of foreign oppression. I mean, you have a menorah, and some Roman official says, what is that menorah? So what are you going to say? Oh, this is a commemoration of the Jewish people overthrowing a foreign oppressor. Not the most politically correct thing to say. So there too, therefore, the Pach Hashemen was emphasized. Not that it was made up, but it was emphasized. So there are a lot of different reasons. It was emphasized, like I've given you 3 reasons if you're following me. Maharal says it was emphasized to give us a perspective that our nitzachon is from Hashem. Some say it was emphasized because as Malchei Hashmonai degenerated, we didn't want to celebrate their victories because it was no longer in support of Torah. And some say the military aspect was de-emphasized because under Roman persecution, it was not the correct type of thing you could safely get away with. So Hanukkah underwent a certain redefinition. But the bottom line is, this is not a negation of the Pach Hashem, and it simply means sometimes it's emphasized and sometimes it is not emphasized. So I wish you all a very, very happy and joyous Hanukkah. May it be a holiday of much light.